Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Maoist Third Worldist Collective. Today, I wanted to talk about the Subaltern, which is also sometimes known as the Fourth World. The term subaltern was used in a Marxist context by Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci was a Marxist-Leninist, an Italian, and an enemy of Mussolini. Mussolini was once asked at the end of his life what he thought his major contribution was, and he said, locking up Antonio Gramsci. That statement makes me like Antonio Gramsci even more than I would ordinarily. Um, Gramsci is sometimes regarded, whether correctly or incorrectly, as the founder of Antifa. I don't know whether that is true. It may be. There really is no specific founder of Antifa. There are numerous individuals and tendencies which led to the development of Antifa, originally in Germany and then later in the United States. Of course, Antifa is an acronym for anti-fascism. It is commonly mispronounced by former President Donald Trump as Antifa, which is very confusing because saying Antifa leaves you with no clue as to what you're talking about. What the heck is Antifa? But Antifa is clear. Anti-fascism, right? So it makes sense to call it Antifa, but calling it Antifa is very confusing. Regardless, um, I think that the notion of the subaltern or the fourth world is a very important one for Maoist third worldists to consider. First, the fourth world are basically people who are completely othered and marginalized from the world. They literally have no home in the sense that they are treated very, very badly. They are not mainstream. They are regarded as being trash in many cases, as being excess baggage. I think it is possible for people who are the subaltern or the fourth world to develop class consciousness, as the proletariat can develop class consciousness. And I don't know exactly how that would happen, but I think that could happen, and I hope it does. And in that event, the subaltern and the proletariat would work together. The term subaltern, while coined by Antonio Gramsci in a Marxist context, I think was utilized most by Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao. He called them the peasants. The peasants were the people who were behind the revolution which led to his rise to power. The communist revolution in China was a peasant revolution. And what that does is that shows the, the progressive nature of scientific socialism. That scientific socialism did not end with Marx and Engels, however important their contributions were. It began with them, perhaps, maybe even before, who knows? As far as I know, it began with them. And I hope it will continue even more into the future. But certainly the work of Mao Zedong with his peasant revolution was a further step in the development of scientific socialism, because Marx and Engels never wrote about the peasants. They never anticipated a revolution which was actually created by the peasants. And that's exactly what happened in mainland China. Mao Zedong was brought to power not by the proletariat, Arguably, there really was no proletariat per se in mainland China. Mainland China was an agrarian society. It was a society made up primarily of subsistence farmers, much like perhaps you could say North Korea is at the present time. And so the way in which Mao came to power was different, say, from the way in which Lenin came to power, the way in which Fidel Castro came to power, etc. It was rather unique because he was entirely brought to power by people who were not workers, by people who were not members of the working class. And so, what Mao did by his revolutionary activity is he forced us to consider one additional social class, a class which had not been discussed by Marx or Engels, the peasants. And I think that the peasants, as I said, are virtually identical to what Antonio Gramsci referred to as the subaltern, and which other people have called the fourth world. Now, who are these people? Well, I think these people can be found all over the world. In the case of China, they made up the bulk of the population. Most people who lived in China were peasants. They were agrarian farmers, they were poor, and yet they are the ones who brought Mao Zedong to power. And yet, even here in the US where I live, there are subaltern people. I can, for instance, turn to people like myself, autistics, although I would not put myself into that category. I would not dignify myself by putting myself in that category. There are many autistics who I think could be considered as being subaltern, and I respect and honor them for being in that category. I am a wealthy man, and as a wealthy man, I could not be considered as being subaltern. To the contrary, I am nouveau riche. I am new money. I am wealthy. I'm a rich guy, and so putting me in the class of the peasants or the subaltern would literally make no sense. But certainly many autistics, maybe most, I'm not sure, but many autistics would be placed in that category for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it is because of the way in which autistics have been treated. Now, I would say this: had my life continued along the line that it was going as a child, I might now be subaltern. But for better or worse, my life took an upward turn, meaning I went up in social class, not down in social class. But I was subjected to the same types of abuse that many other autistics are subjected to. As I mentioned in a recent podcast, I was on psychotropic drugs for my entire childhood, which, as best I can tell, did me no good whatsoever. I was given a battery of 12 electric shock treatments, or ECTs, electroconvulsive therapies, which also, as best I can tell, did me no good. ECTs are good for depression in adults. In fact, many adults will actually seek out ECTs because they work better than antidepressants. You take some ECTs and you feel better. But that was not the case with me. The only effect that my ECTs had on me was negative. They resulted in a year of almost complete amnesia, where I forgot how to read, to write, and to do math. So it was not very pleasant, I can tell you that. I wonder sometimes about the kids that I knew in Creedmoor Psychiatric Hospital, where I was in Queens, New York City, the borough of Queens. I can picture them. I have a near photographic memory, which is, I suppose, both a blessing and a curse. But I can picture them. I remember them walking around. When I just think about it, I can picture them walking around. And I have met many autistics, although I'm not qualified by any stretch of the imagination to diagnose a person with autism. I do have a sense of what autistics look like. There's a certain kind of glare in the eye, a kind of blank expression, kind of mechanical look to the body motions. And I saw those things in the kids that I met at Creedmoor State Hospital, or that I saw at Creedmoor State Hospital. Kids who were regularly beaten by belts by the attendants. And what I wish for them is something that I will not repeat in this podcast. I think it would be very offensive, and I don't want to offend anyone, but perhaps you can imagine what I'm thinking. It is not a good thing for them. I do not wish anything good to come to those individuals at all. I wish for them only pain and suffering. I'll put it that way. So I could have ended up like a poor, unemployed autistic. In fact, my psychiatrist, Dr. Charles Rabiner, nicknamed Buddy, now deceased, said to my parents that he predicted that I would spend the rest of my life on public assistance. He was wrong. He was wrong. Fortunately, he was wrong. I did not spend my life on public assistance. I spent my life in academia, getting a college education, going to graduate school, getting a master's and a Ph.D., and becoming a college and university professor. And I only retired about a year ago. And so my life was nothing like what Charles Rabiner predicted it to be. And believe me, he was surprised, because I spoke with him personally on the phone. He was surprised that I did not live up to his expectations, or maybe better, I did not live down to his expectations. So I could have easily ended up in that class of the subaltern or the fourth world. Why I didn't? Well, I think a lot of it might be my willpower, which is why I don't agree with the 12-step programs, which say that we admitted our powerlessness, basically our powerlessness over will. I strongly disagree with that. I think that anyone, I don't care who you are, anyone, whether an addict, which fortunately I am not, but whoever you are, the only way you are going to get ahead in this world is through your willpower. If you give up your willpower, you will not get anywhere. So I think through sheer will, force of will, I got myself through it. I imitated the behavior of people who were not autistics. I copied them. I practiced behaving in front of a mirror. I imitated the behavior of people that I thought were normal. And I guess I did a good job, because I ended up doing okay for myself. Whether that was the right way to do it or not, I have no idea. I can only go by the results. And the results, for me anyway, were good. For a lot of autistics, and I have known a number, their lives are spent in poverty. on disability. I have a friend who is an autistic who lives in public housing, but he spent most of his life living under the care of government officials, including hospitalized off and on throughout his childhood and youth in psychiatric hospitals. And his life is still not very, very good. He is still not doing that well. Even today, his life is still a royal pain. And I know other autistics, like my father, for example, who was diagnosed with autism, but he managed to get a job. He became, I guess, reasonably successful, but he also became somewhat abusive toward me, which is something I cannot figure out, because generally autistics are victims, not perpetrators. But my father, at least as far as I was concerned, was a perpetrator. My father, however, was also not among the subaltern. He would not qualify for that either, but I have known enough who were. Certainly many poor minorities would fit under the category of being in the subaltern. Many African Americans, especially in my childhood, would fit in that category. Many Mexican Americans, here where I live in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, would fit under the category of the subaltern. So it's a very large category. It includes a wide array of different populations. My main experience, my primary experience with the subaltern is right here. Is it my only experience? No. I've seen them in Mexico and I've seen them in Africa, but not that much, not that much. For brief periods. For the most part, it's been right here in the US that I have witnessed the subaltern firsthand. And I have known many people who would fit into that category. The subaltern can also be called the fourth world because they're in the first world in many cases. They're in the third world in many cases, but they are way, way, way down at the bottom. Way down at the bottom, way down at the bottom, below the average person in those societies. They are basically people with nothing. They literally have nothing. They live their lives on a day-to-day basis, often not knowing where their food will come from that day. I remember spending summers in South Carolina, which I used to do when I was in my early teens, doing civil service work. I remember this one family that I got to know reasonably well. They lived inside of a shipping container, literally a shipping container. You know, like you put on a ship, a box with a hole that they apparently carved in it. That was their home. You went inside, there was no bed, there was no furniture, there was nothing. It was just grass and dirt. And that was their home. That's where they slept. And I guess that's where they ate when they could find food. Despite their poverty, I remember how generous they were at sharing what little they had. So in my experience, many of the subaltern are extremely kind people. I'm not putting them on a pedestal. I realize not all subaltern are that kind. I realize that. But I've met so many that are or were. They had nothing, and yet they gave whatever they could, even if it was nothing or very little. And they sacrificed their lives for their children and for their families, with no promise of any payback. I assume that most of them are now deceased because I was a young teenager, 14, 15 years old. Most of them were in their 30s or 40s, as I recall. And I'm almost 68. I'll be 68 next month. So I assume that they're no longer with us. But they were so kind. I have nothing but positive thoughts when I think about them. And yet they lived under the capitalist world system. They were the chief victims of that system. They were the throwaways, the people basically who had been forgotten by the capitalist world system. Why? Because they were not workers. At least workers can give something back to capitalists. Their work. Now, they typically don't get much in return, but at least they can live to some extent. These people got nothing at all. These were the days before food stamps. There were no food stamps back then. I don't know if they got any kind of aid for families with dependent children or something like that. I have no idea. I never asked any questions. I just tried to listen to them as best as I could. I was a kid and I wanted to learn from these people because there was nothing else for me to do. What else could I do? I knew that when I would be leaving those dilapidated areas in Orangeburg, in Saluda, in Dillon, South Carolina, that I would be going back to Long Island and leading a life of relative luxury compared to them. I had a home. I had my own room, a huge room. My bedroom was the largest room in the house. And so I had something to look forward to. What did these people have to look forward to? I don't know. Such is capitalism, which throws away people that are not needed. If you cannot contribute something to the system, you are trash. You are disposable. And that is how the capitalist world system treats you. And these people could not contribute for whatever reason. And I don't know why. I do know that it was a very poor area. Jobs were not that easy to come by at that time. Even if you did have a job, your job most likely did not pay you very much. Many people lived below minimum wage, and there was nothing they could do. If you were a Black person in South Carolina and you were living below minimum wage, who would you complain to? Who would even listen? No one. No one would listen. That was the tragedy. People who were just throwaways, who were not treated with the normal dignity that one would expect a human being to be treated with. And so I think that that is a pretty good summation of my own experiences with the subaltern or the fourth world, in both the first world and in the third world. They should not be confused with the lumpen proletariat. Sometimes they are. Lumpen proletariat, sometimes called lupen or lumpens, are people without class consciousness. They are workers without class consciousness, but at least they are workers. They have jobs, but they support capitalism. That makes up the majority of workers in my own country, the United States. And it is why there has not been a revolution here. I see these people all the time. I remember at the 1/6 insurrection, when the MAGA people under Donald Trump invaded the Capitol. Those were the lumpens. That was the lumpen proletariat. People totally bereft of class consciousness, and yet working class or working poor. They had nothing, and yet they put their faith in a miserable, I won't say it, a miserable capitalist. A capitalist who did nothing for them, a transactional man, a man I grew up living near. He was only blocks from me. Fred Trump's home was only blocks from my own in Queens, in Bayside, Queens, where I lived. And yet his mansion stood out. That's where Trump comes from, where Donald Trump comes from. Immense wealth made basically as a ghetto landlord, sued for discriminating against African Americans. He would go to his slumlord managers and would say to them, whenever a black person comes in, I'm sure he didn't say black person, but I'm cleaning it up. Whenever a black person comes in, put C after the person's name for colored. He said, in that way, we will know not to rent an apartment to them. He was sued many times, and he lost many times. But so what? So what? That Fred Trump guy, the guy who was arrested back in the 1930s for taking part in a KKK rally, but never charged or convicted. That was Donald Trump's father. That's where Donald Trump comes from. Those are his roots. And so, please, I would beg of you, don't confuse those lumpens, those lumpen proletariat, with the subaltern. They are not the same. They are not the same at all. This has been Mark, by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Maoist Third Worldist Collective. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.